imagine being a mother during the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
Your husband's off fighting, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Food's scarce. Your children are hungry. I mean, really hungry.
Yeah.
And you're so desperate that you're willing to threaten
Yo.
bread or blood just to get your family fed.
Wow.
That was the reality that so many women faced during the Civil War. And today, we're going to do a deep dive into their stories and the things that really happened to them that aren't as commonly talked about.
Yeah, it's a side of the war that often gets overlooked, right?
Yeah.
You know, we tend to focus so much on the battles and the generals and the big picture stuff.
Yeah.
But it's the stories of those everyday people,
Right.
the civilians, that really bring the war to life.
Absolutely.
And show us the human cost of conflict, the sacrifices, the resilience.
Yeah, we're going to be focusing on the draft and conscription and what effects it had on both the North and the South. And we're going to be looking at this through the lens of a really cool podcast episode
Great.
called History That Doesn't Suck.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that one.
It's very good.
Yeah.
And they really kind of break it down in a fun way that's very accessible.
Right. And it's fascinating, isn't it, how this seemingly simple act of drafting men to fight ignited this whole firestorm of issues.
Yeah.
We see economic inequality, we see racial tensions, we see sheer desperation.
Right.
So many stories that I think will really resonate with our listeners today.
Okay, so let's start with the Confederacy.
Okay.
They were the first ones to do a draft, right?
They were, yeah, April 1862.
Okay.
The Confederacy, they were in a really tight spot. A lot of those initial volunteers who had signed up for for a year, they were about to leave.
Right.
And they just desperately needed soldiers.
So they're like, okay, time for a draft.
Yeah, so they took this drastic step and passed the first ever conscription law in American history.
Wow, the very first. Okay,
Yeah.
so how old were the men they were drafting?
So initially, it was men between the ages of 18 and 35.
Okay.
But as the war went on and the need for soldiers grew, that age range
Got wider.
got wider, yeah.
Okay.
So they were eventually drafting men as young as 17 and as old as 55.
Oh, wow.
You know, it was everyone.
Wow, that's a huge swath of the population.
It was.
But there were exemptions, right?
There were,
Okay.
yeah. And this is where things get really interesting.
Right.
And where we start to see some of the cracks in the system.
Yeah.
So initially, if you were drafted, you could actually hire someone to take your place.
Like a substitute.
Essentially, yeah, a substitute soldier.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I could see how that would work.
Yeah, and it did work for some.
Right.
But, you know, you can imagine it was ripe for exploitation, right?
Oh, of course.
Some men would take the money, desert, and then offer themselves as a substitute again.
Right.
And just, you know, kind of make a profit off this desperation.
Right.
So the Confederate government eventually outlawed substitution
Oh, really?
altogether. Yeah, because it was just causing so much chaos.
Wow. So it really was not working.
Yeah.
Okay. And then there was the 20 Negro Law.
Yes.
Now, that one really stirred up some controversy, didn't it?
It did. It absolutely did.
Ugh. Can you refresh my memory? What was that all about?
So basically, this law exempted one white male from military service for every 20 slaves on a plantation.
Right.
The idea was that these men were needed to manage the slaves, you know, keep order on the home front.
Right.
But of course, it created this huge problem, both practically and symbolically, right?
Right.
So practically, it meant that the burden of fighting fell disproportionately on poorer white Southerners.
I see. So if you were wealthy,
Yeah.
you could avoid the draft altogether.
Precisely. And that fueled a lot of resentment.
I bet.
You know, and then symbolically, it just reinforced this idea
Yeah.
that this was a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight.
Right. And you can see how the people who weren't wealthy
Exactly.
and couldn't afford to buy their way out would feel really betrayed by that.
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, it tapped into this existing anxieties of class and power in the South.
Right.
And it really created this sense that the Confederacy wasn't fighting for the common man, but for this wealthy elite.
Wow, that's a huge problem.
It was.
Okay, so the Confederacy's dealing with their draft and all the tension it created, what was happening in the North at the time. I know Lincoln initially tried to rely on those state militias.
Yeah, that's right.
But that didn't really work out long term, did it?
It didn't. Yeah, by 1863, the war had really taken a dramatic turn.
Yeah.
The Emancipation Proclamation had changed the stakes. The political climate really demanded a more unified approach.
Okay.
Lincoln needed a larger, more reliable army.
And that's where the Enrollment Act comes in.
That's right, March of 63.
Okay.
The Union passes the Enrollment Act, and it basically created a federal draft,
Okay.
conscripting men between the ages of 20 and 45.
Okay, so now both sides had implemented drafts, although for slightly different reasons. Were there exemptions in the North as well?
There were, yeah, though, fewer than in the Confederacy.
Okay.
But again, like in the South,
Mm-hmm.
if you had the means, there were ways to get out of serving.
So you could provide a substitute.
Yeah, you could provide a substitute, just like in the South,
Okay.
that eventually got outlawed.
Okay.
But here's the kicker. You could also just pay a $300
Okay.
commutation fee
To avoid it.
to avoid the draft.
Wait, so you're saying you could basically just buy your way out of
Yeah,
fighting for your country?
that's exactly what it was.
Wow.
Yeah, and $300 in 1863 was a significant sum.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Most working class families couldn't afford that.
That sounds eerily familiar to some of the debates we're having today
Yeah, right.
about the economic draft.
It's like, have we really learned anything?
Right. Who bears the burden
Right.
of military service, right?
Yeah.
Like, this idea that
Yeah.
if you've got money, you can get out of it.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like some things just never really change, do they?
Yeah, it's a question worth pondering for sure.
Yeah.
History often has a way of repeating itself,
It does.
especially when it comes to issues of class and power.
Right. And we really see that play out dramatically in the New York City draft riots in July of 1863.
Yeah, those riots were
Oh,
a
man.
turning point
Yeah.
in so many ways.
Okay, so the New York City draft riots, that's a whole other story.
That story for the ages, yeah.
And one that we are going to dive into next.
Absolutely.
But we need to take a little break first.
Okay. It's a story that just really gets to the heart of it all,
Yeah.
The emotions, the tension, everything that was going on beneath the surface.
Mm-hmm.
It shows how complex life was on the home front.
Okay, so set the scene for us.
Okay.
July 13th, 1863, New York City. What's happening?
Well, imagine a city on edge. I mean, really on edge. The war is raging.
Right.
Prices are soaring. People are struggling. And now the government's forcing men to fight,
Right, with the Enrollment Act.
Yeah, the Enrollment Act was a spark.
Mm-hmm.
But the fuel for these riots was this mix of economic hardship,
Right.
anti-black sentiment,
Right.
and some political manipulation thrown in there too.
Okay, so it was a lot of things coming together at the same time.
Oh yeah, it was a powder keg waiting to explode.
And who exactly was rioting?
Well, the mob was largely made up of working class Irish immigrants,
Yeah.
many of whom felt they were being targeted by this draft.
Yeah.
This was a time when job competition between immigrants and Black Americans was fierce.
Mhm.
There was a lot of resentment, a lot of fear.
So it was more than just the draft itself.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're picking up on that.
Yeah.
These rioters, they were angry.
Hmm.
Angry about being forced to fight in a war they felt wasn't theirs,
Right.
A war they believed was being fought to free slaves
Hmm.
who would then, come and compete with them for jobs.
I can see how that economic anxiety, that racial tension,
Yeah.
would create a very dangerous situation.
It was a recipe for disaster. And it all came to a head on that hot July day.
Mm-hmm.
A mob gathered outside the enrollment office, fueled by rage, fueled by alcohol.
Yeah.
It was a bad scene.
So what happened? What happened next?
Well, they attacked the enrollment office. I mean, they just destroyed everything.
Yeah.
They burned draft records, smashed furniture.
Wow.
They even set the building on fire.
Okay.
But their fury wasn't just directed at the draft.
So where else did their anger turn?
Well, tragically, it turned towards Black individuals and institutions.
Okay.
There were horrific attacks
Yeah.
on Black people just walking the streets.
Wow.
Widespread destruction of Black-owned businesses, homes.
It's chilling to think about how quickly a mob mentality can turn so violent, so hateful.
It's a stark reminder of the the dark side of human nature
Hmm.
and how fear and prejudice can be so easily exploited, for political gain.
Right. And it makes you think about all the other times in history where this same kind of thing is played out.
Oh, yeah. It's a recurring theme, sadly.
Yeah.
And there's one story from the riots that I
What?
think really captures the horror of what happened.
What's that?
The Colored Orphan Asylum.
Oh, yeah.
This was a refuge for Black children,
Yeah, safe place.
a place of safety, hope, and even this sanctuary wasn't spared from the mob's wrath.
Wow.
They ransacked the orphanage,
Yeah.
destroying everything they could get their hands on.
That's awful. Can you imagine the terror those children must have felt?
It's heartbreaking to even think about.
Yeah.
Fortunately, the children themselves weren't physically harmed,
Okay.
but the psychological trauma they endured is unimaginable.
Of course. Of course. And, you mentioned political manipulation earlier.
Yeah.
Wasn't there like a political element to the anti-draft sentiment in New York?
There was, yeah. Many Democrats, they opposed the war.
Right.
And they actively stoked the flames of resentment against the draft.
Okay.
They preyed on the fears of working class whites, spreading these rumors that, the war was only benefiting the rich.
Right.
That Black emancipation would lead to economic ruin for white workers.
So these riots weren't just spontaneous outbursts of anger.
No.
There was, to some extent, some orchestration going on, people using this for their own political agenda. That's
right. And the violence that erupted in New York City is a stark example of how political cynicism and manipulation can have these devastating real-world consequences.
It's a reminder that even in a democracy, we have to be vigilant.
Yeah.
About who we trust, who we listen to, and how we let our emotions be manipulated.
Absolutely. The New York City draft riots are a very well-known event.
Oh, yeah.
Even portrayed in popular culture.
Right.
But what's fascinating to me is how they fit into this broader narrative of civilian life during the Civil War.
Right, because while the North was dealing with these riots, the South was facing a different kind of crisis. Right.
Yeah, a crisis that in many ways was even more fundamental.
Yeah.
Food shortages.
Okay, so let's shift gears now.
Okay.
And talk about the Confederacy and this issue of food scarcity.
All right.
Was this a problem that existed even before the war started?
It was, yeah. You see, the South's economy was heavily reliant on these cash crops, primarily cotton, and plantations prioritized these crops, over food crops.
So they could sell them for money.
Right. They were focused on profit.
Right.
And that created a dependence on imports, even in peacetime.
So when the war came and disrupted the supply lines, that became a huge liability.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
And then you add in a devastating drought in 1862.
Oh, wow.
And you have a recipe for widespread hunger and desperation.
And who bore the brunt of these food shortages?
Well, it was the women and children left behind.
Right.
While the men were off fighting. They were the ones struggling to put food on the table, struggling to survive.
It's so easy to forget, amidst all the talk of battles and generals, that there were these very personal stories of hardship and suffering going on,
Yeah, we have to remember that these weren't just passive victims,
Right.
These women, they were active agents in their own survival. They wrote letters, they signed petitions, they appealed to government officials for help.
They were trying to do something about it?
They were doing everything they could.
But did those pleas fall on deaf ears?
Often they did.
Yeah.
And as their desperation grew, so did their anger.
Yeah.
What began as these polite requests for assistance, evolved into organized protests and eventually erupted into what became known as the bread riots.
Bread riots. Wow. We're going to have to dive into that.
Oh, yeah. That's a whole other story.
Yeah. Bread riots, I can't even imagine, being so desperate for food that I'd be willing to riot.
It's hard to fathom, isn't it?
Yeah.
But you have to think about these women, many of whom, had never even thought about protesting or anything like that.
Right.
They're suddenly in this position where they have to fight for their families to survive.
Yeah.
They have to feed their children. And when all the normal ways of doing that fail, they're left with no choice but to take matters into their own hands.
So they were these mothers and wives and daughters.
Yeah.
And they were forced into this role of protesters, revolutionaries almost.
Exactly. They were driven to it by circumstance, by necessity.
And were these riots widespread?
They were, yeah. These bread riots, they popped up all throughout the Confederacy.
Okay.
One of the earliest and most notable ones happened in Atlanta.
Okay.
March 16th, 1863.
Okay.
A group of armed women, I mean, think about that, armed women.
Wow.
They march into the store.
Yeah.
And they demand bacon at a fair price.
Okay.
And the shopkeeper refuses.
What happened?
They take it.
Wow.
They just take what they need.
They're not messing around.
No, they're desperate.
Yeah.
Imagine, I mean, you're so hungry that you're willing to risk arrest, violence, just to feed your family.
That's a powerful image. And just a few days later, there's another riot in Salisbury, North Carolina, right?
That's right, March 18th.
Okay.
A group of women, this time they're armed with axes and hatchets.
Oh, wow.
They force shopkeepers to sell goods at reasonable prices.
Wow, so these weren't just isolated incidents.
No.
This was a wave of unrest.
Yeah, it was a movement.
Wow.
Born out of desperation.
And all of this culminates in the Richmond bread riot. Right?
Exactly. That's the big one.
Okay.
April 2nd, 1863.
Okay, Richmond, that's the capital of the Confederacy.
Yeah, the heart of it all.
So what happened there? How did this riot unfold?
Well, it started as a peaceful march.
Okay.
Hundreds of women, a lot of them wives of soldiers, they marched to the governor's mansion to plead for help.
Okay.
They're carrying these banners that say bread or blood.
Oh, wow.
I mean, that's a pretty chilling message.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They're begging the governor to intervene, to control prices, do something to help them.
But their pleas fall on deaf ears.
They do.
Okay.
And that's when things turn ugly.
Yeah.
The frustration, the anger, the hunger, it just boils over.
So it turns violent.
It does. The peaceful march becomes a riot.
Well.
Thousands of people, men and women, they join in.
Yeah.
They're looting stores, demanding food, clashing with the authorities.
It sounds chaotic.
It was total chaos.
Did anyone try to stop it?
Even Jefferson Davis.
Wow.
The president of the Confederacy himself.
He had to come out.
He addressed the crowd.
Wow.
Pleaded with them to disperse, promised to address their concerns.
Yeah.
But even his words had little effect.
Wow.
The riot raged on for hours.
So this riot, the capital of the Confederacy,
Yeah.
was this a turning point? Did it change anything?
Well, it did bring some temporary relief.
Yeah.
You know, the Confederate government, they were shaken by the scale of this unrest.
Yeah.
They implemented some measures to control prices, distribute food, but the underlying problems remained.
Right, because the war's still going on.
Exactly. The South's economy was in shambles.
Yeah.
The food shortages, they continued to plague the Confederacy for the rest of the war.
It's a reminder that even in the middle of a war, you know, this war for survival, the basic needs of people can't be ignored.
Absolutely.
Right. And sometimes it takes these drastic actions, these riots, to force the people in power to pay attention.
It's a lesson that echoes throughout history, right? Yeah. When people are pushed to their limits, when their basic needs aren't met, they will rise up. Yeah. They will demand to be heard.
And in the case of these women in the Confederacy, they were fighting not just for themselves, but for their families, for their survival.
Exactly.
And it's just amazing how resilient they were in the face of such hardship.
It's inspiring, really.
Yeah. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the civilian experience during the Civil War, what's the big takeaway for you? What should our listeners be thinking about?
Well, I think it's important to remember that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about people. It's about their lives, their struggles, their triumphs, and the story of conscription, of riots, of these women fighting for bread for their children. Right. It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can endure. Yeah. And it reminds us that the decisions made by those in power have a real impact on the lives of everyday people.
It's a powerful lesson, and one that I think we all need to keep in mind.
Absolutely.
As we go about our lives.
Yeah, we can learn a lot from the past.
Yeah, and it's just fascinating to see how these things connect to the world today.
Yeah, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Right. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep learning.
And keep listening.